I want to take just a moment to tell our internet audience that our annual conference will be August 3rd through the 5th, and our guest lecturer is Dr. David Trobisch, a German biblical scholar who is, what I've always said about David, I haven't said it to his face, but any room he walks into, he's the smartest person there, which I know can be pretty isolating, but I have never heard David Trobisch lecture that I didn't learn something. I am really looking forward to having him here. A lot of our internet viewers take this annual conference as their time to make their Hajj to their internet church. So we do want to encourage you to come and be with us. Just shoot me an email and let me know that you're coming, and I'll give you any details that you need about housing or whatever, or the schedule for the conference. Those of you here that haven't done so already, there's a Facebook event page for our conference that's resident on the Emerging Church. You can also get it off my page, but I've just posted the schedule that I'm hoping all of our musicians will cooperate with. So the detailed schedule for the event. So looking forward to getting it started. Well, as today, we all know the story of Anne Frank, that little German girl who was forced into hiding from the Nazis in the attic of their home in Amsterdam. And we know that the family and their 4 friends that hid with them in the attic were all found and executed. But the diary that Anne wrote while in hiding is a classic that very few of us in the Western world made it through school without reading. There's one passage in that diary that strikes me as being particularly apropos to our current situation. She writes, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. I can feel the sufferings of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come right, that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again." Now, we're living in a time in which people have grown very tired of hearing commentators on the news say that what Donald Trump did today is unprecedented. In fact, MSNBC's news host, Stephanie Ruhle, started to fine guests on her show $1 for every time they use the word unprecedented, because our president's unwillingness to act like a president, his constant willingness to insult our oldest and closest allies, his willingness to ignore the very serious crimes of dictators and tyrants, our most dangerous foes, as well as his whole demeanor of narcissism, greed, racism, and moronic misspelling tweets not only embarrasses us, but it gives leaders of governments around the world perfectly good reason to be rationally afraid. Now, I was a kid in the 1960s, but I remember the turbulence of the civil rights movement. I remember the violence associated with the protests of the war in Vietnam and the economic stress of serial recessions that came after that time. So I don't want to be guilty of exaggerating our current situation to say that this is the worst thing that's ever happened in America. It's not, but it's bad. It's the worst maybe in a couple of generations. And I think it's safe to say that Donald Trump is the dumbest and the most mentally unstable person ever to sit in the Oval Office. And I would include the White House custodial staff in that. I'm not just talking about presidents. This man's intelligence is below average. But as Anne Frank said, I still think people are basically good. If we give them a chance, most people are good, even though in this present moment we are revealing some of the absolute worst aspects of our national id. I'm confident, as she was, that this is not the turning point of history. This is a season in history, and it will pass. And our society will again find our riverbanks and return to sanity. Peace and tranquility will return one day for those who survive the current crisis. But I took as our wisdom lesson today this brief quote from Harper Lee's famous 1960 novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, in which this Alabama Depression-era lawyer, Atticus Finch, is explaining to his daughter, Scout, why the people in their quiet little town had suddenly become so racist and so filled with malice. He says, sometimes the Bible in the hand of one person is worse than a whiskey bottle in the hand of another. There's just some kind of folks who are so busy worried about the next world that they never learn to live in this one. And you can look down the street and see the results. In Scout's world, people were polite. They were church-going, respectable folks. But when a black man was falsely accused of raping a white woman, Scout is forced to see her entire town, people she was the most familiar with, in an entirely different light. And it is difficult not to vilify people for doing bad things, evil things, horrible things. But the rational truth of it is that most people are basically good. All of us have blind spots. There are potholes in our character for all of us. We will do things for self-serving reasons that are thoughtless or are cruel. I honestly don't know who to give credit for coming up with this observation, but it has been said that a religious person will do what he or she is told to do, regardless of whether it is right, and a spiritual person will do what is right, regardless of what they are told to do. I should add a footnote that all of us can be pretty religious at times. I mean, some of us will just go with our prejudice unthinkingly before slowing down enough to rationally think about why we are dismissing one group or another. But Harper Lee was drawing a controversial sword in 1960 when she has her character, Atticus Finch, point out that religion helps some people to be better, but it covers up the moral failings of others, or possibly worse, religion can provoke them to do more evil things than they would have done otherwise. The physicist Steven Weinberg said, with or without it, good people would always do good things, bad people would always do bad things. But for a good person to do evil things, that takes religion. That religion will convince otherwise generous hearts to become cruel, judgmental, shaming, and evil. The goal of the progressive faith movement is not to discard our faith heritage or to despise it, but to help restore it to sanity. I believe that the root of all world's religions, whether that's Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, they all began as an ethical conversation about how to do good and about how to be a compassionate person. It's only when these ethical conversations are mixed with dogma and magical thinking that they go off the rails. If we, something like what Thomas Jefferson did, simply take a penknife to our Bible or any other religious book and cut out anything about stuff that is otherworldly or stuff that is invisible or stuff based purely in magical conjecture, and then just read what you have left, even what remains in some cases are not going to be good moral teachings for the 21st century, but most of it is. If you get behind the packaging of miracles and magic, what is there is teaching about how to be a radically compassionate individual. Now, the difference for us is that we want to be in dialogue with religious texts, but we don't really want to be obedient, right? I mean, we don't want someone telling us how to think or how to act. Many traditional Christians, like Catholics and Lutherans and Episcopalians, are raised on creeds, and they are taught to memorize the right answer to a catechism. Those of us from more evangelical backgrounds, we actually have a lot in common with most of the practice of Islam in that we were expected to literally memorize large portions of our sacred text. But in all quarters, there was a stated or implied insistence on rote memorization, whether it's a creed, a catechism, or the Bible itself, and we were taught not to overthink it, just to obey it. You really can't say that we don't do much the same in other arenas of our life. I cringe a little bit every time someone calls me Reverend. Doctor is a title I earned the hard way by going to school, but the implication of Reverend is that I've been somehow divinely set apart, and I don't like the implication of that. It does not feel good to me. Even being called a Christian sometimes, I don't want to be associated with most of what passes for Christianity in our world. But I have more or less the same reaction when someone says, well, you're a Democrat. Well, more than half of what Democrats have done would embarrass Charles Darwin at this point. I don't want to own that label. My former in-laws were true children of the South. They were staunch members of the conservative, non-instrumental Church of Christ. And as such, they were convinced that Baptists and Methodists and even their cousins in the Christian church were all going to hell, every bit as much as Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus. But they also felt the same way about being American, and more specifically about being Republican. They were so offended when they found out that I voted for Jimmy Carter that our relationship was never redeemed. They were as offended by me voting for Jimmy Carter as they were of my Disciples of Christ heritage. Dogma, ladies and gentlemen, does not teach you to think. Dogma asks you to stop thinking. Don't think, just believe. And that's true for politics, and it's true for religion. I fear it can also be true for grammar. I mean, Mark and I feel like we have to edit the entire internet almost every day. I don't know how many people I have told that a lot is 2 words, always 2 words. It's never 1 word. And y'all is an implication that you've never darkened the door of a classroom. You shouldn't say that. We've said it, but you shouldn't say it, right? I mean, there's no one that should be that dogmatic or normative. I'm not trying to make light of our current crisis, but I am making something of a faith statement that I believe in the basic goodness of our species, and that this current cloud will pass. This too shall pass. People will return to sanity. The question is, what could we possibly do to help that happen a little quicker? Let me hold the door open for you. Now, generally speaking, I am willing to be totally over most of the literature of the self-help movement of the 70s and 80s and absolutely everything that Psychology Today ever published. But if you don't mind me snatching just a little gem from the dung heap of pop psychology, the very popular book of the 1970s, Dr. Eric Burns' Games People Play, diagrammed the interactions of the id, the ego, and the superego in our communication and relationships with one another. To make it a little bit easier to understand, he called our three ego states the parent, the adult, and the child. Our prejudices, our immediate decisions, almost always come from the parent. You literally memorize your parents' opinions, judgments, teachings, and they exist in your mind forever. And so anytime you make a snap decision, it is coming from your parent ego state because it doesn't require thought. You couldn't get through the day if you didn't have a parent ego state. You don't, you know how some people will walk into McDonald's and just stand there mesmerized by the menu, and it's like, get out of the way, it's McDonald's. You know, I can cover my eyes, I can read it to you from left to right, I can tell you everything. But our parent ego state holds all of those instantaneous decisions. And you can even see certain body language aspects of when you're about to speak out of your parent ego state. If someone is raising their finger when they speak to you, or if they have to stand up to deliver their lines, they are entering their parent ego state. The child ego state, well, religion also resides there. Even elderly couples will sometimes, you'll hear people that have been married for 50 years, a husband will say to his wife, "Did you really spend money on that?" "It's here from the store in a bag, there's a receipt." But that is a parent speaking to another adult, their spouse, as a child. It's shaming kind of communication. Or, "Would you please start doing the dishes, your own dishes, or wash your own clothes?" We oftentimes start conversations in a parent voice to a child. Dr. Byrne asks his readers to see that the parent voice in us is trying to control others through shame and dogmatic statements, but the child in us, the child is where the playfulness is, that's fun and irresponsible, but the child also demonstrates inadequacy. Like when someone says, you know, "We've agreed to a meeting next week on Wednesday at noon," and they say, "Will you call and remind me?" They are a child speaking to me as if I were their parent. I adopted one little Asian girl 30 years ago, and I've not adopted anybody since. So when someone says, "Will you call me and remind me of the meeting?" I say, "No, but I'll loan you $5 so you can buy yourself a calendar." What I could say is, "No, but I'll tell you what, I'll remember it and I'll expect you to do the same." Yeah. You know, you can change the nature of the dialogue. You see, it's one thing for us to call our president a liar, because he is. But it's another to remain in the adult mode. And then when Trump says that Germany is entirely controlled by Russia because they get 70% of their energy from Russia, we could start name calling and, you know, making other, you know, when someone speaks to you from the child ego state, they are trying to either drag you down to the child or force you to be a parent. But you can choose to say, actually, Germany gets 22% of their energy from Russia, all in the form of natural gas, only because they don't want to burn as much coal. But they've got a 500-year supply of coal, and any day that Russia acts badly, they can start burning coal again. Now, you can speak from your adult to the adult and the other person, and they may choose to reply, "Fake news." And again, that's an invitation for you to come down to the child and say, "You're a moron," which can be satisfying at a certain level, but not helpful. You keep coming back. When someone is trying to push you into being a parent or a child, you keep speaking as an adult to the adult in them. Also, Germany is adding more solar power and wind-generated power every day, and that many days in Germany, they are entirely energy independent based on renewables. That's an adult response. And the more you give adult-to-adult responses, the more they are encouraged to join you there. when he says that the United States pays for 90% of NATO's expenses, you can say, actually it's 17%. It's not 90%, it's 17%, and quite a bargain at that. When we shame our Trump-supporting family members and friends for having voted for a child-stealing, misogynistic, Islamophobic, xenophobic moron, then we are taking the parent role of judging and shaming our relatives who have decided to act like children. What we want to do is try to engage them as an adult to say, a friend of mine adopted a Guatemalan. I went down and helped her get him, and he is now a teenager who's a big Trump supporter. And I'd like to say, is that perhaps self-loathing that you're supporting a person that hates brown people? You know, I think you really need to invite people to come back to an adult evaluation rather than for me to say, I found you in the jungle and brought you here, and you should act better, which is true. I found him in the jungle, and I brought him here. But the larger point is, you're a brown American, and you want to be careful about supporting a racist. You don't speak to their child. You don't speak to their parent. You try to speak as an adult to an adult. And it may take months. It may take dozens of exchanges. But the hope is that we will have more adult conversations and less name-calling and shaming. About 25 years ago, I was visiting a counseling client who was a patient at the Marion Center, a local mental hospital. And she'd gone through a painful divorce and then had some rocky relationships afterwards. And she began trying to manipulate her parents, her ex-husband, her boyfriends that were trying to get rid of her through suicidal gestures. So she had made 4 or 5 symbolic gestures at killing herself, and finally the police got involved and she found herself against her will at the Marion Center. And I went to visit her, and she said something to me that day that has stuck with me forever. She said, what I have learned through all this is that if I don't want to be treated as if I were crazy, I need to stop acting like I'm crazy. Traditional expressions of Christianity, with all of its Bible studies and sacraments and guilt and shame and fear, has not proven effective in stemming the tide of insanity that is currently pouring out of our White House and our Congress. And it is now spreading threateningly into the Supreme Court. Every provocative tweet, every incendiary allegation, every dishonest, narcissistic statement invites us to get down into the mud with him and his supporters, and with good reason. I'm just saying, don't do it. They may deserve to be chastised. Just don't do it. They may be acting like idiots. Just don't call them an idiot. Choose to be an adult who speaks to adults. If shaming people for being ignorant would make them smarter, the Ozarks would be the Mensa Club capital of the world. If provocative name-calling and pushback would make people be rational, then Putin would be a Peace Corps volunteer and Kim Jong-un would be a hairdresser. But the truth is that we presently, in this difficult challenge, we have some hard days ahead of us, which means we have some hard work ahead of us. I wish that all Christians could get their head out of the clouds and stop worrying about heaven and hell and start worrying about kids getting lead poisoning from tap water in Flint, and brown kids being put into kiddie prison in Texas and Arizona, and poor people dying due to lack of access to health care. I don't mind their theological diatribes on baptism, communion, and their tediously repetitious praise hymns. If only they would feed the hungry and house the homeless and care for the sick and welcome the aliens in our midst. To our evangelical friends who may have accidentally found our YouTube channel, I have to say, you guys have been going to Bible study all your lives. And when you hear Sarah Huckabee Sanders or Jefferson Beauregard's Sessions tell you that it is biblical to take children away from their parents, you don't need me to remind you that that's not biblical. You don't need for me to tell you that the Bible in their hands is as dangerous as giving the car keys to a drunk Stevie Wonder. You already know better. And I know that you are basically good, and that removed from your partisan invective, that there is an adult in you that is ready to return to sanity. I just want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.